Hey, everyone. I'm David Heyman. I know most of you guys. Phones to stun, please. So I'm going to keep this really, really short. Our guest tonight, we're really happy to have Chris here because we've been trying to get him here on reviews for a while, and we're really glad to have him here as a speaker. So Chris Cornelius is a rising star in architecture. And we're really happy to have him right at this kind of point where all of a sudden things have taken off for him, but he's not yet so far in his career that he won't answer our calls. You know what I'm saying? It's very, very sweet. So Chris went to school at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and UVA, architect, shown in many places, including the Biennale. He is a member of the Oneida Nation and has a lot of work with Indigenous American groups, both community work and commissioned work. And he is the chair of architecture at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque for the last 2 years, which I think is really significant. I mean, it's significant for cultural reasons on the one hand, and then it's particularly significant because it brings to the table, without question, the dilemma that has been at the source of much rich conversation in after-modern culture, which is who has the authority to speak for whom? A thing that architecture has managed to sidestep in a lot of ways, but many other cultural endeavors have tackled head on. So we're completely thrilled to have you here, Chris. Thank you so much. I mean, I'm just going to end at that. Please welcome Chris Cornelius.
David, for that wonderful introduction. What kuf nuela du, Chris Nyongetsak wahoni wagita loda, okele oneta aga nuwagadun choda. So I said in Oneida that I extend my greetings, love, and thankfulness to all of you. I am Chris Cornelius of the Wolf Clan, and people of the Standing Stone is the earth that I come from. I am a citizen of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin. I grew up on the Oneida Reservation in Wisconsin. And as David mentioned, I went to architecture school in Wisconsin and Virginia, started teaching at UVA, and then I went back to Milwaukee, and I was there for 17 years, and then I got the position of chair of architecture at the University of New Mexico, largely because I didn't want to be an administrator at all. It was the kind of thing I ran from, but largely because that was a place that I felt I could do something, and I realized in the middle of a talk like this that things are not going to change in our profession unless someone is in leadership to change them. So I decided to go after that job, and I'm so happy that I did. We have wonderful faculty. Our student population just in architecture is 10% Indigenous. I don't know what ASU is, but I think that's one of the highest in the country. Because I had very distinct thoughts about how architecture should be made for Indigenous people in contemporary society. So it started as a graduate student. I will say that as an architecture student, both in my undergrad and grad, I saw nothing Indigenous. No one ever showed me any Indigenous examples, talked about any Indigenous architects. I had to, for myself, take what I was learning and find the parallel for me as a designer, as an Indigenous person, and what that meant. So when I was basically writing my application essay for UVA, I started to realize there has to be a better way to make architecture for Indigenous people. And what I had seen at that time, this was the late 90s, was that buildings were in this form, which I call the zoomorph. This is the elementary school that was built on my reservation, was built in the 90s. I didn't attend that school, but it's a turtle. The gym is in the head. It has eyes made of tile. The kindergarten is in the tail. But when you get into the building, there's nothing turtle about it. It's just a radial plan. The turtle has cultural significance for our people, but that significance isn't part of the architecture. And then the other kinds of buildings that I saw were what I call the pictograph, which is just a normal building with Indigenous iconography applied to it. I think in both of these cases, it doesn't particularly indigenize the work. And so it made me think of this on the right, that these buildings are really ducks and decorated sheds, and that the sign is the culture. How is it presenting the culture? How can we begin to think about it? So I started to think about it as an experiential thing. How do we make this architectural experience that conveys the culture? I started my practice in 2003 when I was asked to be part of a design team with Antoine Predock, who was selected through an invited competition to design this Indigenous school for a group in Milwaukee. So 2003, I was just 3 years out of graduate school. The school itself, part of that competition, they required that the team have an Indigenous designer on the team. I was actually on another team, but they never really consulted me. During the competition, Predock gets hired. He asks, who did the other team have? And they said, well, this guy, Chris, who lives in Virginia. The dean of the architecture school was on that committee, so he knew who I was. They started looking at my work, and they realized that we don't want a turtle either. So let's talk to Chris. This was one of the most fortunate things that happened in my life, to be honest, to be able to work with someone like Antoine, to do the thing that I had wanted to do, and that is to design contemporary place for Indigenous people. So the school is a K through 8 school. It's a private school, endowed. Students don't pay tuition. There's about 350 students. They're all coming from the 11, most of them are coming from the 11 tribes of Wisconsin, but others come from other Indigenous nations. They learn one of 4 languages, Ojibwe, Menominee, Oneida, Ho-Chunk, in the school. But we really wanted to strip these sort of institutional names from the school, so that this really complicated relationship between education and Indigenous people, we're trying to decouple that in a way. These columns that you see that are these trees, they were harvested from the Menominee Nation within Wisconsin. So we're trying to make a place that not only is a place of education, but it is a place of culture, it's a place of community, and a place that these students could see themselves in it, that they can begin to learn their culture and begin to see those things within their spaces and their everyday environments. So I created this graphic that is everything from the surface of the site all the way to the moon, and then some subterranean levels. So when I made this, I made it so that when it printed it out, it was like 6 feet high. It was as high as me. So when I explained this to the clients, it was the same height as I am. But what I was trying to do is to begin to show that when we're intervening as architects, we're actually intervening in a system of reciprocities. That it's not just about the site itself and the environs, but it's actually a very complex system of reciprocities. So it does affect the things all the way up to the moon, and starting to think about what lessons can we learn from our non-human relatives that actually burrow into the earth. In Wisconsin, there's a 4-foot frost line, so that's how deep the frost is in the wintertime. All the foundations of buildings have to be below that. So I started to think, well, who and what is burrowing into that 4 feet or below that 4 feet, and seeing the complexities of their world, beginning to see the height that butterflies migrate at, where are the migratory birds across the site, where is the airline traffic that's happening, where are the seasonal winds and the weather happening, where does most space travel happen, and where are satellites, all the way up to the moon. So that this thing is really comprehensively seeing all of that. Now the image itself changes vertical scale as it goes up, but for me it was a way to compile that way, because I think if we render it visible, then we're thinking about it, right, as designers. We're not just like thinking about it and putting it aside, but when we render it visible, we begin to think about it more deeply in a more rich manner. So one of the cultural values of indigeneity that I want to share with you, that is a big part of my work, is this idea of relationality. So we think of things as if we're related to them. We say that we're related to all living things. This includes stones. So this is why we call the earth our mother. The sky is our father, the moon is our grandmother, the stones are our grandfathers. We mean that almost in a literal way, because it's a different way of seeing the world. And so I created this graphic. So what we did early on in the project was to pull out all of these cultural values of these 11 tribes, make them visible, and then I put them together in this way so that we began to see how that was affecting the building. So we started to change the names of these programmatic elements. We never ever, and the school has been open since 2007, they have never called the place that they eat the cafeteria. Where you enter the building is not called the lobby, it's called community. The theater is called drum. The stair that connects the elementary school grades with the middle school grades is called earth to sky because you see it as a rite of passage. The student entrance that I showed the photo of is called migration. Students still call those things those names. Also, part of my role was to how do I embed culture into their everyday sort of existence, and so I named all of the classrooms, and the classrooms are named by grouping. So some are about trees, so one side of the corridor is deciduous trees, the other side is evergreens, and they're trees that these cultures share. Or they're animals that are in the wetlands, the muskrat, the turtle. So when a student says, what classroom are you in? They don't say Miss So-and-so room or Mr. So-and-so's room 132. They say, I'm in turtle, I'm in sweetgrass, I'm in sumac. That's how they talk about the building. And thinking about that idea of how buildings are, I think a part of that is important. So another aspect of my work and how Indigenous people think about nature and architecture is that there's the differences between what we're seeing or what we do see in architecture school on the right, like Logier's frontispiece. This is the origins of architecture. The architect is pointing at nature, which is becoming the architecture, and we see it. On the opposite is how Indigenous people have seen architecture. It's a part of nature. And so on the right, it's a commodity, it's a raw material, it's a resource for us to use and have dominion over and to be in service of our architecture. On the left, it's a relationship. It's about entering into that relationship and beginning to understand that we're, as designers, an important part of that. So the ways that we see nature, I think, is really important too. And so on the right, because it is a commodity, we see nature as mine to possess and use. And on the left, it's nature as me. I'm actually a part of it, right? As a designer, I'm part of this system. So in some Indigenous cultures, not all, we talk about plants as our oldest relatives. They've seen drought, they've seen good growing seasons, bad growing seasons. Some are food, some are medicine, some are poison, but we understand that there are relatives. I think that we should be thinking about buildings as our youngest relatives. We put these things into the world, they take up a lot of resources, they breathe, they sweat, they produce waste. What are the responsibilities that we have as designers when we're doing that? I am very fortunate to still have the Indian Community School as a client 20 years later. I'm working on a master plan for their 200 acres with them. I've designed a couple of other buildings on the campus. I've designed a lot of furniture for them. But I see that as an important relationship, not only as a sort of client-designer relationship, but really as a part of being a part of that Indigenous community in Milwaukee. And so really think about the project in that way, that it is a thing that Antoine and I were collaborated on and made it this thing in the world that is a place where these young students are being educated. So I just wanted to show you a few things that I talk about these models. I was doing this at a time when after the school, I didn't have a lot of commissioned work. I basically gave myself assignments. And I really wanted to sort of break out of this idea of like the architecture is a metaphor for something. I felt like making architecture for Indigenous people relied on that a little bit too much. What if I started to think about an architecture that I'm not clear about who or what made it? Was it a person? Was it an animal? What does it do? What are the references? I didn't want to think about any of those things, so I started making these models out of found boxes, and instead of using scale people as the figures, I used scale animals as the figures in these. Each one of them, for the most part, I used these found boxes. This is a base of an old sewing machine. It's like a site, when we get a site as an architect, it has a history, it has contingencies, we can't make it bigger, we can't make it smaller, we have to kind of deal with it. And in this one, this is called the moon scope. It's a place to lay and see the moon. We're not sure whether the elk is looking at that because it happened upon it and it's surprised. It just made it and it's proud of it, or something else. Like that's the thing that I'm trying to think about this, so that in many ways I'm removing myself as a sort of author of the thing, and this thing is the most perfect thing in the world, and it has to be the best idea before I make it, build it, draw it. I'm just making these things. I'm just making them as I go along. And a lot of it is just experimenting with the materials. They're made out of brass, copper mesh, bronze. I cast these landscapes out of hydrocal, and you can see the scale figures there. Some of them started with drawings in my sketchbook. Others were basically three-dimensional sketches. So I want you to sort of make a mental note of these models as I begin to show you other built work that I did. Around the same time, I started to make a series of dwellings that I call the domicile series, and they're based on my tribe's moon calendar. So most indigenous cultures, we have a calendar of moons that are guided by ceremony and things that are happening in our world. So for instance, we have a maple syrup moon. This is a time we're gathering sap. This is when trees are giving us sap, and we're gathering it, we're boiling it down. Or there's the strawberry moon in the summertime. This is when the strawberries are ripe, and there are usually rituals that go along with those. So I started to make these, again, in a way to not make a metaphor of the moon, right? So this one is about food gathering. And so it's not trying to make a metaphor about food gathering. It's really just saying, well, what if I just used, for instance, in this case, I'm just actually using the wind data of that month to generate some of these things. And in this case, it creates that wing structure. I wrote a little note on this in my sketchbook. I roll out my cloud to make it rain. So the bear is pulling out this irrigation system on the landscape. And then I started to think about what structure is. Everything doesn't always have to be columns. What if this was just tightly bundled sticks? And what if that was the thing was holding up? So in this series, I did 8 of these. I have a 9th one in process. We have 13 moons. Each one of them takes up the same amount of space. Each one of them is displaced from the ground. Each one of them have these sort of antennae. They may or may not communicate with each other. It may be ornamental. It may be functional. I didn't want to answer those questions. I'm trying to also work in a way that I'm cognitively using a part of my brain that we're not always using as architects. The one that's like editing everything and parsing everything and making it perfect before we show it, we draw it, we make it. And so this one is called the thunder moon. The clap of thunder, it's the first clap of thunder that happens. It might actually happen at night while I'm sleeping, so it has this apparatus at the top, and that apparatus made me think of the deer's ear, because a deer is prey, and so it needs to hear its predators coming, and so then I put the deer in the sketchbook. If it comes into my mind, I put it in the drawing. These drawings are made in a very layered way. When I started making them, I didn't want them to be so like precious and finely drafted. That's why I splashed watercolor on them. One of the last things I do is draw these things around it. I'm actually using an ellipse template in a wrong way, meaning I'm mismatching the ellipses. You probably don't even know what that is, but I'm mismatching the ellipses so that they actually look like they might be bending. I don't know what it is. Could be a bird, could be an insect, could be a Wi-Fi signal, could be technology that doesn't even exist or we know of. But it felt like to me it should have this thing going around it. I should also mention that I haven't erased anything in my sketchbook since 2003. I just stopped erasing. So you'll see like little false starts in here. Each of these drawings has an underdrawing, the drawing that it started with. And when you start to draw, I think we draw how we think, meaning like if things become more resolved, that's when we darken them in, we hatch them, we color them. But it's okay to just draw over the mistake instead of erasing or flipping the page and starting over. But as I was making these, I was making 3D models in Rhino at the same time. And I originally did that so that I could cast the shadows on the watercolor elevations correctly. But then I started to think, what if I started to render these things differently? What if the ways that I'm digitally making work is also in the same sort of language? So in this case, What if I didn't see the world at this 5-foot eye level, 6-foot male point of view? What if I started to see it from the wolf's eye level? And what if the wolf is looking up at that? This structure, instead of having structure, it's like structural hair, like a porcupine. And it's getting, the wolf is getting so close to it, it's almost poking it in the eye. And what if the wolf can see things in the sky that I can't see? I don't know. None of us really know. Scientists probably know. But we know that birds can see things that we can't see, right? They can see magnetism. They fly towards it, they fly away from it. What if the wolf could see those things? So I'm trying to actually use the digital tool to begin to show other worlds or other possibilities. Because for me, that's indigenous knowledge. In indigenous knowledge, we see things like stories, what you would call myths, hallucinations, the spirit world. Those are applicable knowledge, just like math, science, geology. That is also the same kind of knowledge. So what if the wolf had a kind of knowledge that I needed to tap into? So when I started building installations, this is actually the second one I did. It's called The Trickster. I received a residency for a place called Bookworm Gardens in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, just north of Milwaukee. It's a children's literature garden, so I was playing on the idea, a role of the trickster in indigenous storytelling. The trickster tells us things about who we are as humans, really. We shouldn't be greedy, we shouldn't take too much, we shouldn't eat too much, and we see the consequences of that in the story. So what if I made a structure that wasn't really clear what was the form of the thing, what's the purpose of the thing, what's the program of the thing. I wanted children to come to this place and start telling their own stories about it. So while I was actually making the thing, I ran into this young woman and I asked her, what do you think about this? And she didn't know I was making it. She was like, well, it looks like animals made this and then people came later, or it's from a movie I haven't seen. And I said, exactly. I said, that's exactly what you should do, right? Is because it's important, again, for us to use those kinds of ways of understanding and seeing the world. So I made this out of trees that I harvested on site. It's loosely based on this model, which was from the previous series of model. When I was making the models, I thought about this, the role of regalia in indigenous culture. Regalia is not just ornamental and aesthetic, it actually shows us who someone is, what they've achieved, where they're from. So on the right is a gastoy or headdress of the Haudenosaunee people, which is part of my confederacy, the Oneida. I know that this person was Mohawk because there's 3 feathers up. If there were 2 feathers up and 1 feather down, they were Oneida. If there was 1 feather up, they were Onondaga. So we identified ourselves by that. Also, I know that this person is a chief because there's antlers on it. Our chiefs are elected. We have the longest running democracy in the world, still running today. I won't get into all this, but if you Google it and look it up, the U.S. Constitution is largely plagiarized from our confederacy. Our leaders have always been elected. There were a group of elder women who vetted those men to be elected, so they got to determine which men were right for leadership, and then they were elected. So I know that this person is a chief because of the antlers on it. So my friends from Spirit of Space wanted to make a film. They sent me a message and said, Chris, we want to go film The Trickster because there's snow. And I said, go for it. And one of the wonderful things about the film, and I didn't tell them like how to film it or what kind of story I want them to tell, but what they did for me was to see the thing in a different way. I love how they filmed it because it looks as if it's an animal that they get too close to, they might scare away. And we can see how they sort of built this story. You get a little bit closer, you start to see parts and pieces of it, and then you finally happen upon it, and you can see yourself inside it. The copper mesh that's on this is the same exact spec as the copper mesh I made on the models. So I'm taking what I'm doing in the model and making it full scale. And so that was the second installation I did. This was actually the first one. I was one of 10 designers asked to compete for 5 Miller Prize Miller Prizes from the Exhibit Columbus in Columbus, Indiana. So they assigned us to sites, so it was basically a head-to-head competition, and if you win the competition, you get to build the installation. I was assigned First Christian Church by Eliel Saarinen, and the piece that I did is called Wikiami. Wikiami means wigwam in the Miami language, or Miamia. They are the people that are indigenous to that part of Indiana. So if you do or don't know the long history of Columbus, Indiana, this was one of the first, if not the first, modernist church ever made in the U.S. And Eliel Saarinen and his son Arrow had a practice together and when they made this. But I wanted to look at the dwellings of the Miamia people. Like many cultures in the Great Lakes region, they build wigwams, and those wigwams are saplings that are bent over, and then they're clad with either cattail reed mats or bark shingles. And so I wanted to reinterpret the bending. Instead of bending over, I decided to bend it up, and instead of using saplings, I used steel rebar. And I used an expanded steel cladding, which I call its feathers. Now, so that one actually relates to one of the other models that I had a little drawing. I was wondering, like, what if the cladding was like feathers? What would that actually look like, and how would that overlap with one another, and how would they be attached? So it was there for almost 2 years until the second iteration of Exhibit Columbus. I forget which one they're on now, a third, fourth iteration. Each year they kind of slightly change how they give out the Miller Prizes. I was asked to design a permanent land acknowledgement for Lawrence University, which is a small liberal arts college in Appleton, Wisconsin. They wanted to acknowledge the fact that they're on Menominee land. The Menominee were largely indigenous to Wisconsin, and so I call this piece Otechea, which means crane in Menominee. The crane are one of the clans of the Menominee, so I asked one of my friends that's Menominee, how do you say this? What would it be? It's important to me to name these pieces in those languages because the land needs to hear the language. If we think about this, the land heard indigenous languages for thousands of years, 20,000 years, 10,000 years, and then it stopped hearing it. So for me, whether it's an indigenous person, non-indigenous person, someone just reading the plaque, the land is at least hearing the language, and the place then is using the language because that's what they call it. Now, one of the wonderful things about this particular piece is that there are indigenous students, and I worked with the indigenous students and wanted to know what they wanted to see. They don't see anything on their campus that reflects them. And so this was an opportunity for me to make a thing that they could say, well, this is about being Menominee. So this is the land base of the Menominee. They had occupied that much of Wisconsin, which actually included Milwaukee here, and then Green Bay, Madison, the biggest metropolitan areas in the state. If you look at the satellite photo of Wisconsin, this looks like a Photoshop or glitch, that rectangle. That's the Menominee Nation today. They have always sustainably harvested their land. They have, over the past 100 years, increased the yield of that land by 40 to 50%. So they're getting 140 to 150% more wood out of that piece of land. They're not guided by annual yield. They're guided by the trees telling them who needs to come down. And they have an entire forestry system and practice that is based on the culture that makes that wood actually very desirable for furniture makers, and like the floors that are made in most basketball arenas come from there as well. So this piece is made out of weathering steel and has a pattern, a custom perforation pattern that is based on one of the Menominee patterns. And one of the things that distinguish Menominee from other tribes is some of their pattern making can actually be abstract and geometric. So that is one of the things that I'm playing off of. But the students actually now have a place to gather, have a place of protest, have a thing to say, go meet me at Otechea. They have a thing that identifies them within this place. This university has a program called College Horizons, where they bring Indigenous high school students to it. They talk about what it means to go to college, how do you apply to college. So they actually have Indigenous students from all over the U.S. that go to this school. And so they were ones that I worked with and talked with early on in the design of the piece to think about what they wanted to see and what they wanted to have. They wanted to have something you can get into, a place you could meet, something that had some significance on their campus. This piece is called Not My HUD House. I was asked to be a part of an exhibition at Crystal Bridges Museum in Bentonville, Arkansas. So they asked 5 designers to be a part of this exhibition called Architecture at Home. And so what I wanted to do was to address Indigenous housing. This is one of the things that has always been sort of brewing in my practice, in my work. I actually, I'm much older than I look. In the 90s, I actually designed 12 houses one summer that all got built, and they're on my reservation, and they are unremarkable. Because they just needed houses, and I'm just like cranking out all these ranch 3-bedroom homes, 1,200 square foot things. And again, that sort of planted the seed in my mind that the way that these things are coming out should be better. And so in 2021, I was Luke Kahn visiting assistant professor at Yale. I taught a studio where the students were addressing housing in Manitoba, this community that's 6 hours north of Winnipeg called the Opaskwayak Cree Nation, which is in the upper right. And the premise of the studio is that when I look at this place in Canada, this place in the Great Plains, this place in the Southwest, the house that I grew up in on my reservation, they're all the same house. Almost literally the same house. Now, they have nothing to do with the cultures, nothing to do with those environments. The ones in Canada perform so poorly that there's mold in those homes because they don't have basements, right? There's just ground underneath. There's air that's circulating. It's very cold outside and very just trying to be warm inside. They're almost all this same plan, and I will say the plan of the house that I grew up in is almost exactly like this one. But this is a fancy one because it has a master bath. Our home only had 1 bath for the 4 of us. But the things that I really sort of responded to is, how was I supposed to succeed when there's no place for me to do my homework? There's no porch. There's no garage. There's no way to get water off the roof very well. All of these things, like, I started drafting in high school, and I was sitting on the edge of my twin bed with my drafting board, like drawing these house plans for my classes and competitions and things. How was I supposed to succeed in that? How is anyone supposed to succeed in that? How are we supposed to, as Indigenous people, become part of society if this is the thing that we're sort of given? So what I wanted to do was make the thing that this is not. My HUD house didn't have a view of the sky. My HUD house didn't have a place for a fire. Like I said, it didn't have a porch. So it didn't have a place for my non-human relatives. So in this piece, I'm trying to do those things. So I've given it a porch. The entry is from the east. Almost all Indigenous dwellings, you enter from the east because this is where the sun rises. We send our guests off to the west because that's where the sun sets. These little shelves that are part of the apertures are intended to be there for birds to actually nest. As architects, I feel like we spend way too much time and effort trying to keep birds off our buildings. Why aren't we being good relatives to them? The number 2 killer of birds is buildings, aside from natural predators. They're flying into windows. They think they see sky and they fly at full speed. So why can't we make things that are actually good habitats for these other relatives? I covered it, I was thinking about the idea of regalia. I covered it with jingles, and jingles are a part of Indigenous women's dresses. Started in Ojibwe culture, but is now sort of pervasive. It's on their dresses, and it makes this amazing sound when women are even just walking and dancing. But what if my house had regalia of my culture? What if my house had feathers so I could fly off this reservation? That's what this has. So I couldn't afford to build this sort of big masonry hearth fireplace, so I made the steel framework that I clad in the same copper mesh that's on the Trickster, so that is the symbol of the place for fire. like I said, it has regalia of my culture. It has a view to the sky. It's letting light in different ways so that I can see the sky. It's letting light in high, letting it in low. So you're always aware of where the sun is. And it's always sort of illuminated. And so I'm trying to tap into these other things that have happened in Indigenous architecture for thousands of years. Now, many times those views to the sky were associated with fire. So my people built longhouses like the lower right here. And it's called the smoke hole. And the longhouse size was determined by how many smoke holes it had. 3 smoke holes, 4 smoke holes. Some of these were hundreds of feet long. If we look in the southwest, Kivas have holes in them. Chaco Canyon, Pueblo Bonita, Hogans have holes in them. This idea of always being aware of the sky is what I'm trying to have as to be a part of this, and also thinking about my non-human relatives. So when we did these renderings before we built the project, I wanted to sort of show it in different seasons. And if you notice, there are different animals. In this case, there's a deer that's on the porch. And thinking about that so that the deer doesn't see it as a foreign thing. This actually happens with the Indian Community School, meaning deer walk right up to the building, cranes walk right up to the building, birds come up right up to the building. So one of the first things the teachers told us was like, these students aren't paying attention because they're looking out the windows at all of these animals. Some of the classrooms had like binoculars. We made apertures that were sized for the students, so some of them are actually this low in the kindergarten so they can climb into the window. And others are, because in a school, K through 8 school, you've got people that are all kinds of sizes, right? So there are different sized apertures. So I was thinking about that, and while I was there making the thing, I found this. Deer tracks that are in the mud that go up to the porch and then they stop. So that means a deer definitely went on the porch. It may have gone inside. Someone sent me an Instagram video of deer right next to it. That, to me, that's confirmation that what I'm making, they don't see as a foreign thing. They see it as a friendly thing. I'm trying to be a good relative to them. They may need a place to hide from their predators. That's okay. Come on in. So that piece is intended to be a larger study of how I think Indigenous housing should be. This is built in a modular way. This is 2 modules. Our families grow and shrink significantly. You could have 3 or 4 generations in one home. If that happens, you build a module, you add it on. One of the modules is the sort of infrastructure, plumbing, heating system that you plug into, but there's no bedroom, living room, kitchen, dining room. Why do we subscribe to those labels and saying we can only eat in this room, we can only sleep in that room? In Indigenous dwellings, those things happened in one space. This could be a place of ceremony, it could be a place of diplomacy, it could be a place of making, it could be a place of celebrating, eating, like all of these things happen in that space. And so I'm just trying to make that kind of space that you could add on to and begin to think about in that way. Recently I completed this project. I designed the exhibition space for an Indigenous ceramics exhibition at the Milwaukee Art Museum with a group, the Chipstone Foundation. They have this gallery space in the museum. So this is one of the things that another thing that's been part of my work and thinking about is how Indigenous cultures are exhibited in museum spaces. Oftentimes it's without context. Like in a natural history museum, you might see a totem pole next to a longhouse. Those 2 cultures are on either coast of the U.S. They don't really communicate with one another. There's no context. The other thing is that the artifacts that you see, you think of them as being of the past, of a history that's past. In this case, we're seeing ceramics that are based in traditional skills that these people have learned, but they're contemporary things. So I made this thing. I was a co-curator of the exhibition too. I called it Knowledge Beings because each one of these pieces holds Indigenous knowledge. The Indigenous person that has made these things has embedded them with knowledge. And I also wanted to transform this gallery space. I wanted it to be a thing that you were immersed in, that you forgot about the fact that you were in this buried black box thing, that the works are not just on pedestals behind acrylic with the tombstones, that they're actually embedded in this space. So there's 13 pieces for the 13 moons. The 13th is this. We have this film of the sky because you're inside this space. I wanted to have this at least simulated sky inside the museum space. So we hired a videographer to make this, filmmaker to make this film that actually goes through 24 hours of sky in 20 minutes. So at some point you see the northern lights, you see geese fly over. All of that is part of that, because I also want this to be an experience where if you came back another day, the sky might be different. The lighting inside the space actually adjusts to the color temperature of the sky. So when it becomes darker, the lights go up. When it becomes lighter, the lights go down. That includes all of the pieces that are exhibited there. So I also designed the seating, because for me, we always see these like museum benches, and I always feel like there's like passive things, but really they should be places for us to sit and think about the things that we're seeing. So I wanted that to be a part of this. So it's in this sort of, I don't want to call it round, but it is kind of round. For me personally, I don't use many circles in my work. I certainly don't use a circle as a generator of plan. I feel like it's a trope. That's just me personally. I feel like it's an indigenous trope. So I actually use this ellipse because what I'm trying to do is expand the amount of space that I can use in the gallery. And so I thought of the gallery as full. What if I think of it as a mass that is full and this is being carved out of? So I start with this cone. The cone has the sky hole in it. That's where we're actually seeing the projection. Then I add this other shape that allows you to get closer to the artifact. So it's in this sort of head height zone, so that each one of these artifacts then have their own way of being embedded in the structure. So some are carved out, some are cut at corners, some are sort of these swipes. These are the artifacts, and then you enter into one of these, and then each one of these is a segment. I worked with these really amazing fabricators, current projects in Milwaukee. They built this system where they actually hid doors in this. We hid all of the mechanical equipment is coming through the sky hole. I had the photographer Photoshop out, but there is like one fire alarm thing and the ceiling. But we avoided all these other things. The tombstones, which you normally see in a museum, right? They're the things on the walls. They've got the artist bio, this, that, and the other. We said, how do you want to be identified by the artist, and what do you want to say about the thing that is not just like factual registrar information, made of clay, 18 inches by this, that. What if it was actually a part of this, the ways that they're exhibited? So this one has it sort of embedded here in that piece, and then each one, it's in the acrylic base. So there's light coming from above and below each one of these spaces. It's intended to be immersive. It's intended for you to think about these pieces. Some are big, some are small, some are as tall as we are. And then there are these contemporary pieces that are taking on Pueblo culture and using them in a contemporary way. I love this photo because it is the juxtaposition of the thing that I'm trying to resist, which is just outside in the museum. Their ceramics are on these pedestals with the acrylic things. And each one of these are spaces that are made for each one of these objects. So they're like homes for each one of these objects. And so that was this one, the editor's pick for the Architect's newspaper this year for exhibition design. We also changed the floor, so the floor is different when you step inside. This piece is the piece I completed for the Chicago Architecture Biennial. This closes on the 11th of February. And so when they asked me to do this, I started to think about, well, I don't want to make a land acknowledgement thing for Chicago. I can't really speak for those people, because what if I started to think about me as an Oneida person working in that place? I'm a stranger. So I named it The Stranger. I looked up how you say that in Oneida. It's Aguidaze, which means stranger. And so this is an extension of the Not My HUD house the ways that home was sort of made. But I tried to, because it's inside now, I tried to make the regalia more significant. I'm trying to think about this idea that, one, it's a strange thing, that it's divided in this weird way, like openings are sort of cut off. The jingles are more significant on this piece. Its opening faces the east. Part of it is actually clad in deer hides. I often think, and probably almost always really, to be honest, think about architecture as animals. I think about it as inhabiting the space. What are the lessons that I can learn from the animals or the coloration of the deer? I have a lecture that I give second-year undergrad students about materials, and it's all animal analogies. And the title of the lecture is called "Why the Deer's Ass is White," and I explain why it has these white parts and why it has the dark parts. But this piece has those three sort of zones. One part is called the tail, the other is the haunch, and the shell. Inside, I created a video of the sky in my backyard in Albuquerque, New Mexico. This is one of the amazing things about that place. The sky is extraordinary. I'm just always struck by it. It changes. It's always sunny, and I can see the stars. When they pass by, it becomes a really sort of significant event. So I'm thinking about that in this piece. So how can I think about me as a stranger intervening in Chicago and making this thing? The other thing that I'm trying to tap into is, again, this realm of indigenous knowledge that seems like it's spiritual or sort of mystical. I was with the artist Edgar Heap of Birds, really established indigenous artist, and we were just talking one day, and I asked him, are there stories in your community that if you told non-indigenous people, they wouldn't even believe you? I said that because I have stories for my community, and he said yes. So he told me the story of the deer woman, and the deer woman in where he came from is a very attractive woman that attracts bad men, basically. And then the men are never seen again. Then just a few weeks later, this showed up in the show Reservation Dogs to the first season. There's an extraordinary one in the last season about the deer woman. So she defies time and age. So this is actually the sheriff in the town when he was a kid. But we don't see that she is part woman and part man until she's getting in the car. We see that she has feet of a deer. Now, in our culture, I believe that to be absolutely true. 100% true. I don't doubt it. I've never seen it. I'm not going to tell you the story about my thing, but we have a similar thing. I've never seen these things, but I believe it. That is indigenous knowledge, right? So why can't a building have deer hides as cladding, and then these jingles on it as well? So I'm trying to tap into that level of indigenous knowledge. The three pieces, the carapace, the tail, and the haunch. And then the tail, where the jingles are, is actually a star map that's projected onto it. And then the jingles in the star map, you can see intensity, like the dots, where there's more intensity or where it's brighter. The stars are bigger, so there's more jingles in those areas. So I mapped that onto the piece and put those on it. The piece, like I said, Chicago Architecture Biennial is closing on the 11th. The Museum of Wisconsin Art is taking the piece. They're going to have it on exhibition in West Bend, Wisconsin for a year. So I'm happy that it has another life. But these are the ways that I'm thinking about architecture. And I started thinking about it in the drawings. I started thinking about it in the models. And I'm really looking at it in the built sort of realm of things. And I'm really interested in that dialogue between those things. When we make a drawing, when we make a model, when we make a building as architects, we're told and taught in many cases, at least I was, that you think of the thing and then you represent the thing and then you make the scalar representation of the thing in order for them to build the full-scale thing. What if the ways that we're drawing and making these things are actually affecting the thing itself? And so that's what I'm trying to do. There really weren't any drawings. I gave the fabricators the 3D model of this, and it's kind of largely how I work. But making the model and understanding how that thing worked, how can I actually make that into these built forms is really the thing that I'm thinking about. So I like to think of design as ceremony. I like to think about the responsibilities I have as a designer, again, putting things into the world. That ceremony includes rituals like drawing and making models and thinking and talking to people and making visual things. But I borrowed the term from Sean Wilson's book, Research is Ceremony. And in the book, he talks about, in Indigenous, epistemology, ontology, axiology, and methodology. The sort of framework of understanding things that is used in Western models of research, right? And if we thought about what they are, right, epistemology is knowing, ontology is being, axiology is valuing, and methodology is doing. So the work that I'm trying to do, I am trying to tap into these knowledge systems, the epistemology, and the being Indigenous, the ontology. So I believe an Indigenous person sees the deer hides and the jingles in a very different way than the non-Indigenous person. Also, when I am the person, the Indigenous person, crafting these things, making them, attaching them, getting on the lift, stapling them, I'm actually embedding them with indigeneity, right? That is also part of its ontology. So the work that I'm doing is I'm trying to find the sort of balance of making all of these things. Now, I think that as an Indigenous designer, I can encompass all four of these and make architecture for Indigenous people. A non-Indigenous designer might have a little bit of knowing, even less being, maybe some valuing, but maybe more methodology, but never really fully encompassing that. So for me, there is a difference between Indigenous architecture and architecture for Indigenous people. I believe that Indigenous architecture has to come from Indigenous people, Indigenous designers, not just Indigenous communities, Indigenous designers. Architecture for Indigenous people is architecture that's made by non-Indigenous designers for Indigenous people. I think there's a distinct difference, and especially when we think about it in this way. So the last topic I'm going to talk about is decolonization. I feel like a little bit, I've been trying to use the word less and less. I feel like it's starting to get into this realm of diversity where it's just a term we're using and not really doing anything about it. So I write it in this way because I see it as an active project that I'm trying to do in many ways. As an administrator, I'm trying to be a part of the system so that I can dismantle, rearrange the system to allow more people through it. Not just Indigenous people, but just students, right? Like just thinking about like what was your life like that you ended up with a C in this class and you need a C+ to pass it. What was happening? Okay, I'm going to let you go on to studio, but you have to figure out how to manage your time and talk to your professor, right? So this is the thing that I do as the chair because I was a person, it took me 6.5 years to graduate undergrad because there was a stupid gate that was a GPA threshold that I couldn't meet. That doesn't mean jack shit. Doesn't mean anything in the world that I got a C+ in my second year studio. No. I still got into Ivy League grad schools. I got a UVA, I got a Yale, I got in a Penn. So that number does not determine any one person's success or ability for success. In the same way, I don't assume that all of you ended up in this room on the same path, or you shouldn't assume that I ended up in this room on the same path, or a path that you might know or recognize. This is where we kind of need to be, especially as architectural educators. But I do think that we need to understand what colonization is sort of fundamentally in order to dismantle it. So I borrowed these terms from Linda Smith's book, Decolonizing Methodologies. She talks about the vocabulary of colonialism. The first is the line. She talks about the map, survey, or territory, right? Saying 13 original colonies, Louisiana Purchase, United States, and then you survey that so that you own it or can take it. The second is the center, or creating the orientation of the system of power, making the capital. You know, Romans put churches in the middle, so establishing that seat of power. The third is this idea of the outside, that the territory and people are in oppositional relation to one another. We're inside, you're outside, build a wall, keep them out. That's colonization. These terms, we use these terms in architecture too all the time, right? Like, they might mean slightly different things, but we should be thinking about, at least I start to think about, the line when I'm drawing it. Am I drawing a thing to separate or bring together, or to render something visible in the world that wasn't possible before? But I think that the fundamental thing that fuels colonization, perpetuates it, and keeps it going is a lack of empathy. If we're not thinking about one another, if we're not thinking about the fact that people may be different than we are. Now, when I say this, I really kind of mean it, and some of the most difficult parts of the empathy is how are we empathetic with those we don't agree with, right? And likewise, because it's that separation that happens that will continue this colonization. So I often say, for better or worse, you can agree or disagree, you don't have to be indigenous to be colonized. However, it has different sort of resonance with us as people. And true decolonization is about the land and the dispossession of land of people in the United States, or what's called the United States and what is now called Canada. In order for decolonization to happen, land has to be given back. Now, can that be 100% done? No, right? It's not going to happen. We're not going to get rid of capitalism. We're not going to give all the land back. So let's not even talk about that. What can we do to make those systems work for more people? That's where we should be, right? How can we make architecture that is for more people? So I think that architectural education, I love my education. I love the fact that I became an architect, or an architecture professor even, because what architecture was really good at is like the what and the how. Here's a school. Here's how you design it. Here's a museum. Here's how you design it. What we haven't been so good at is the who and the why. Who are we making this for, and why are we making it? Is a building an answer to this solution, or is it a solution to this problem, or are there other problems that the building is actually exacerbating, or can we actually think about it mitigating that situation? So the last project I'm going to show you is a sort of speculative research project that I've been working on for a number of years. It's been kind of hard for me to go back to, but I started to think about the American Indian occupation of Alcatraz Island, which happened from November '69 to June of '71. And the thing that struck me about the occupation is they didn't want it for like political or economic gain. They wanted to build an indigenous university, indigenous cultural center, indigenous environmental center. They wanted architecture. So this was a time when Alcatraz was decommissioned as a prison, and it was in the federal land surplus. A treaty that the U.S. government made with the Lakota people, the Treaty of Fort Laramie, the U.S. government says any land we deem surplus, you can have it. So that's why they took it. They negotiated in good faith with President Nixon and Governor Reagan to take the island to do those things. So I got really sort of compelled by this idea that they wanted architecture. So I wrote this grant proposal that supposed that they got what they wanted, and I'm going to design the Indigenous University. I'm really going to think about what it means to educate indigenous people in today's society. But when I started to really dig in the complexities of this, I saw how really complex it actually is. The graffiti on the island is really important. It's a way for them to sort of claim territories. And if we think about most social movements, rhetoric is really important, right? Like what it's called and what we say, like Black Lives Matter, #MeToo, like those are important things. And so saying that you're on Indian land, so what they did was with painting, they erased all these references to the United States and said you're on United Indian property. If you go there today, a lot of this graffiti is there. But what it forced me to do was draw in a different way. How am I compiling the complexities of this really intense thing? How do I start to think about this? So I started to make these drawings that are thematic. This one is called trajectories. I just drew every edge of every building with the same instrument off every edge. Then I started to think about other trajectories: the boat traffic, the ferry traffic, airline traffic, seasonal winds, light. The America's Cup was going on when I did my research there, so I drew that in this. But I'm also thinking about the indigenous history of trajectories of death. The Trail of Tears. So if we imagine Florida down here, Oklahoma up here, people were literally walked that far. Many died on the way. Some settled in other places along that. So all of the people in this region were sort of forced into Oklahoma. My people, the Oneida, is that sort of band up there. We took the Great Lakes to Wisconsin. And at least part of us settled there in 1822. So all of those things are part of this. So I draw these on Mylar. What you're looking at is about 3 sheets of Mylar. I'm drawing it front, drawing it back, using mostly graphite, colored lead, tapes, plastic things, all kinds of things. Tape dots are in there, draft dots. So this one is called territories. So I'm thinking about how territories are claimed. I had all these maps from the archive, the geological maps, landscape maps. So part of that is in the coloration of this. But I'm also thinking about land secession. I'm just using these 2 states as examples because one on the left, I'm using South Dakota and I'm using Wisconsin. On the left, what is gray there was called the Great Lakota Nation. The U.S. government came and said you can have all of this, but then they came in at another date and said you can't have that, you can have this, you can't have that, you can have this, you can't have that, you can have this, until the federal reservation boundaries that are the yellow ones that are drawn there. My people, the Oneida, when we moved to Wisconsin in 1822, before Wisconsin was a state, we purchased with the Menominee that much land, bought it. Said, okay, if this is the system you're working on, here you go. Then in 1831, the federal government said, you can't have that, you can have this piece. Okay, so we purchased that. Now we're existing on land we bought twice. And in 1838, 10 years before Wisconsin became a state, federal reservation boundary made the yellow part, and then we bought all of that land. Now we're existing on land we purchased 3 times. And then the Dawes Allotment Act happens in the late 1800s, wipes all of that out, starts it all over, allows the homesteaders to come in, allows everyone else. We have an entire municipality, incorporated municipality within the boundaries of our reservation. The eastern edge of the reservation actually overlaps Green Bay proper. We have a county line that goes through our reservation. We have an airport that's in the sort of southern end of the reservation. So we don't own all of that land. Even though we paid for it 3 times when we were trying to participate in the system, we don't own it. So those are the kinds of histories that I think we need to be talking about, especially as designers intervening in the landscape. We need to know these things. We need to know things like Acoma Pueblo. These are the first cities in the U.S. These are the first multi-story buildings in the U.S. This should be part of our architectural history courses, right? We should be talking about Chaco Canyon and our building technology courses. It's extraordinary masonry. It's masonry that rivals what the Romans were doing, and there's just no way they could have communicated. They figured out how to make round masonry buildings. They figured out how to make lintels. They figured out how to align all of that with the stars and the moon. All of that was part of it. By the way, we do teach those things in our classes at University of New Mexico. The other parts, we should be thinking about things like petroglyphs are a way of claiming territories. There's a group that are 3D scanning them to kind of preserve them. The other thing is I had to really wrestle with how am I going to tell the most difficult parts of this history? And what stories am I going to tell? So I indexed this with this date, 12/29/1890. That is the massacre at Wounded Knee. On that day, over 300 indigenous people, unarmed, mostly women and children, were gunned down, murdered. This is the United States Army in that picture. All of these gentlemen received commendations that should posthumously be removed, but haven't. This is how these people were buried in the dead of winter in South Dakota. You can imagine how difficult that was. I don't know about you, but it looks like genocide to me. This is one thing, one day. One day. Now, I'm not for casting blame. I'm not for casting guilt. holding people accountable. I'm for telling the truth. Let's just tell the truth about the difficult parts of how our country was founded, so that we, as those that are intervening in those landscapes, cities, places, whatever, we know these histories, and we're trying to make that a part of how we communicate sight to the rest of the world when we examine it. When we start doing site analysis in our studios, we shouldn't just start when it became Austin. I'm sure it was an indigenous settlement long before it was a city, or Chicago, or Milwaukee. I know for a fact that Milwaukee was an indigenous settlement. The surveyor who surveyed the state before it became a state surveyed all the indigenous settlements. He also measured all of the mounds. He measured them, put them on the map, put them in his sketchbook, talked about how the indigenous people took care of that landscape. So we just need to be telling the truth about these things. And I just think that that's what we should be doing and what we should be doing in design schools, because if we're the ones that are building things in this landscape, we should know how we got to where we are. This is kind of where the project is now. I've done these massing studies, so I'm going to put this university on the southern end of the island. I really want this building to be like an animal. I really want to think about things like, how do indigenous people get to this place while it's still a state park? How is it different, and how should indigenous people be educated in the 21st century that's different than other places? Yawako, thank you.